Everybody, welcome back to Addiction, Alcoholism, and the Three Principles. My name is gregsuchy, and I'm back again with Harry Durbitsky today, and we're really excited to kick off the new season again with Dr. Amy Johnson. It seems like a great way to kind of kick things off. So this time we're actually going to talk about a really neat topic, and we're talking about what do we talk about when we talk about spiritual versus psychological? What does that even mean? Are they really even different? And if they're different, how are they different? How do these apply to, recovery and finding that freedom from addiction? So I'm pretty excited to have Amy join us today to talk about this. I know Harry wanted to say something real quick before we get started. So I'm going to pass it off to Harry.
Thanks, Greg. We're going to make this into a podcast, and I find this topic to be really interesting because it's about spiritual psychology rather than just a psychological approach that leads to spiritual understanding. Also, I want to announce that we're going to, the addiction community in 3P is going to be throwing a conference in May in Minnesota, 2 days in a meet and greet, and Amy is instrumental in that, and she's on the program committee. She'll be a co-host and or co-monitor, whatever you call it, and it's kind of fun to work together. And Greg and I hope we'll be able to share a little in that conference as well. Amy, we're looking forward to that. So in this spiritual journey, I thought I would read something from Sid to start it off, and then we'll get to what Amy says. If I can just, I really like this. What baffles me, this is from the Enlightened Gardener Revisited. What baffles me is that I know it works, and I've helped some people beyond my wildest dreams, but still it mystifies me. She wrinkled her brow in bewilderment. It's like one big psychological puzzle. Andy laughed at her confused look and replied, "You are the therapist, not me. Never in a million years would I ever tell anyone such as you what to do or what not to do. I am simply telling you about the existence of the principles and how they work. And you are talking about what you do with them. One is before the creation of any form, the other is strictly form. But just maybe, if we listen to each other with open minds, we can come up with something that will help both of us to understand how the form and the formless are attached to each other. Who knows? You may find the answer to your own question." So with that in mind, Amy, go ahead and let's see what we come up with. And please, everybody, participate. You're all welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me back. I was thinking about this before, and I thought, oh man, I hope we can just have a discussion about this, because I don't even know. I don't know anything about it. I mean, I just to me, it's a little bit like the spiritual versus psychological. I don't really even see a difference much at all. And I don't know, the whole topic is one that I just kind of stay away from typically, which is sort of strange that I brought it to this conversation to talk about. But I think, it feels to me like a distinction that's just kind of a conceptual distinction that doesn't like if we're even dividing spiritual versus psychological, it feels a little bit like, oh, okay, already now if to even talk about the difference and talk about what's this and what's that, we're sort of off into the psychological and conceptual, and we're already kind of limited in our discussion. So that's just sort of, it's so interesting. Like, that's thinking about this again, there's a lot of groups out there, a lot of people out there nowadays, especially, that love to talk about the package of the principles, maybe versus the package of non-dualism or other things and all of that. And and I steer clear of all of those conversations. So again, it's ironic that I brought it here, but I would love to just have an open dialogue about it. And I think for this to be good, we kind of have to all have an open dialogue, because I think it's worth looking at. And especially, Harry, I know it comes up a lot when we talk that you talk a lot about the spiritual. And so I'd love to hear even your, like, how it looks different to you and others as well, and just kind of share from that place.
Sure. Well, for me, because of what I was trained for, or listened to from Sid, it was only a spiritual reality, and the psychological took care of itself. And so if you were in a good space, a good feeling, the psychological automatically fit into the connection of the two. And when we were listening to Sid, we weren't listening for information, we were listening for formlessness. We were actually trying our hardest to quiet our mind down and listen to a feeling, and he would fill us up, and we wouldn't know what he was filling, what the spirit was filling us up with, but we knew that the weeks that followed we had changed. So I see spiritual as formlessness before the creation of. And that's what I see psychology as, the creation of from spirit.
Yeah.
And to connect those two, Sid obviously put a heavy, heavy emphasis on thought. Missing link, he was always talking about thought. But he wasn't talking about ego thought. He was talking about original thought. Mm-hmm. And that sometimes gets miscommunicated, because all I can understand, Amy, is the more I understand that the world is spiritual, the better a human being I become, the freer I become.
Yeah.
And that's a tough message, and that's why people like yourself and Greg and all the other, and me, came out, because the world couldn't understand that. How could you just talk about formlessness? But primarily, that's what Sid did.
So when you say, or again, this is for anyone, like when we say, like when you say that, when you see that the world is spiritual, what I hear in that, and what I've seen be really helpful for people, is that kind of like you said, that we have this sense that thought is what brings our experience, but thought isn't cognitive. It's not psychological thought. It's the vehicle of thought. It makes way for psychology to take shape, and it brings content to life. But we're looking before the content, and that's where things are nice. Is that kind of what you're saying, or is that different?
That's where the healing is.
Yeah.
The healing. So when you have an insight, like say you're teaching people thoughts and to be feelings type of stuff, and they have an insight from that, and we know that they definitely have in your school and your teaching, it's spiritual. What happened is their little mind quieted down for a second, and the spiritual crept in. So we're not conscious of that happening, but basically the process is always the same. The little mind quiets down for a second or for longer, and the spiritual pops in, because it's always there inside of you.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. So, I mean, I think that's how most psychologists who are aware of the principles, like I don't practice psychology in that I'm trying to change people's thoughts or feelings or anything like that. Now, like you said, I hope their thoughts and feelings change, because I know that's going to give them more freedom, but it's not about going to that level, right? And trying to change things at that level. So I guess that's where it's interesting, because I think sometimes there is a distinction even in the principles around, like, psychologists versus these people. And I think, again, to me, it's just it says something about what you've seen about this understanding and about how life works, is that it no longer would make any sense to go in and do psychology where you're trying to change the psychology. It's all about having a sense of how the psychology is working, maybe, but not in the weeds and the content of it, but in what's powering it and what's beyond it.
Well, that's the thing, is I believe that the thing we're calling spiritual is the only thing that actually really exists, and everything else is just something that we've constructed via thought. It's like we said, the formless coming to form. Whereas what you just talked about, like looking at the plant or looking at the grass, versus we're talking about the roots. You know, we're talking about where our true health and well-being comes from.
Yeah.
And I think this is a great idea for a conversation today. And we actually have Yvonne with his hand up. And I want to remind everybody before we go to him that I just have people muted to keep down a background noise. So if you have a question or comment at any point, please feel free to cut in, or you can click the raise hand feature in the participant tab. So with that, Yvonne, you can go ahead. I've got you unmuted, hopefully. Actually, it won't let me. There you go.
Thank you. I like what Harry said about spiritual and psychology. Spiritual being the formless and psychology being the form of the same thing. I'm currently reading a new book from Sue Lachman that is a transcript of 4 webinars with Dick and Bettinger, Uncovering the Light Within. And it's awesome. I don't know if it's that book but something's happened to me. Like time slows down, and I can see how people I'm relating to, talking to, are acting on their thoughts in a way that I haven't seen before. And that makes the spiritual aspect of this even more visible. From that book, or from Jack Pransky written a book called Hope. And there he is telling about how Sid was talking in a spiritual manner from the beginning, and how the community made him be more practical. Can you remember that, Harry? You were around at that time?
I was actually before that time, so I don't remember that, Yvonne. But
have you heard about it?
All I saw was that at the beginning Sid talked spiritual, and then the psychologist came, and then it became practical. The language changed, the message changed, and the people came in at a very high level. So it was like they could take it out to the world, and then they had to learn how to do that. And so they would take it out to the world, and Sid would say, no, that's not it. You're mixing up the principles with what you believe. And so then he'd break it down, and then the 3 principle movement would get smaller, because he'd keep breaking it up and saying, no, that's not pure enough. So he never deviated from the purity of the message, but the psychologists were able to reach the world. And in that sense, it became very practical. It also, for me, became very confusing, because I wasn't interested in talking about problems, as Amy suggested. And So what happened was I stepped away from it. And then when I came back, where I had found myself more back again listening to what Sid was saying, just as Amy was suggesting, the spiritual and the psychological became one. And from that point of view, I started to be able to relate to the 3PG community and so on. That's just my story of what I saw happen.
Yeah, I can agree. It is one.
It is one, and that's why when Amy teaches, she's sharing, and anytime Amy's sharing, she's spiritual. That's just the way it works. Anytime anyone shares what they understand that helps people, it's spiritual, and that's what we're here for. We're a family, a community. We're one. What's beautiful, when Greg and I started, we were two guys. And even though we hardly had talked, we became more in union. To me, that when I worked did a little bit with Amy, I learned so much. Like, she has no idea how much she helped me. It was spiritual, what she was sharing, but she was sharing what was on her mind and the way she saw it. And that's what we want to have in a 3P addiction community, where we're all one big family. And in that one big family, that's spiritual. That's what Salt Spring was, one big family.
And that's what the Dickens is talking about in this book, uncovering the light within.
It's only one message, really. It's all love. It's an understanding. It's only one message. I pretend I could tell Greg something. Well, I found out I couldn't. Or I could. It's us sharing our wisdom together, and being honest when somebody is not quite correct. That has to be part of it. Feedback. We're growing. We're all just babies in this journey. And the thing with the addiction community, I feel, is we are babies. We are just. Amy is doing phenomenal work, but what she'll be doing in 5 years will be even more phenomenal. That's just common sense. And so we're growing. And when we share, we grow. We grow in the feeling of love, and we drop our personal. So I think, Amy, would you say psychological is about the personal reality that we live in, and spiritual is about the impersonal reality we live in?
As concepts, yeah. I mean, if we're going to split them up and talk about them as concepts, yeah, probably. Yeah. I mean, psychological is, it's personal, and it's cooked. It's like, it's of form. It's done already. That's what I think is so cool about, seeing that we can look a step before the form, because everybody's running around trying to fix stuff that's done and over with. And so it's so nice to see that we don't have to go in at that level. When you guys are talking to me, what kind of strikes me around this too is so cool about it is that the more we get, and please don't anyone take this personally or anything, like you're saying, Harry, like we're all learning and seeing more all the time, but it's like the more we get a little hung up, or we get all into those conversations of like this way versus that way, and this form versus that form, I think that just happens more in the beginning. But I think more as you get a feel for the fact that it is one, you can absolutely say something like, I don't know, to talk about, making some change to your thoughts, which somebody could say like, oh, that's psychological. We don't change thoughts here. And like, who cares? Because it's just language. Like, our language sets it out as being separate and conceptual, but we can talk like that. The more we're grounded in this bigger knowing that it is really just one. Does that make any sense? Like, once you know it's all one, of course, like even like three principles, there's not three principles, there's one principle. But when you have a feel for that, you can talk about three principles as kind of separate things and how they interact. Now, somebody could come in and be like, that's not right, that's really one, but we know that, like, that's okay. You could, it has value in both. It has value as the oneness, and it has value at times in separating it out. And that's all just for illustration purposes. It's not literal. It's just to illustrate something, I assume, right? That he broke it out into three principles. And so you get to kind of go out and then come in a little bit, and go out and come in a little bit. And I guess that reminds me of a little of that. Like, it's deeply spiritual. It's ultimately spiritual. We know that. And at times we're having a little more of a psychological conversation. Now, not like an old school psychological conversation. I'm not having those anymore. Those just don't make as much sense. But sometimes you are talking about content and details and things like that, but from the understanding of what it really is.
And the end result is always a spiritual insight, but it may look like a psychological insight. That's where healing, that's where the healing power is. I had one client where I just talked about the spiritual reality, and she dropped her addiction. Well, I hadn't talked about addiction, but she had an insight within herself, and it just washed away. When you listen to Greg's story about insight, it's the same thing. It's just he was doing stuff, and then all of a sudden he saw an amazing world, an amazing reality, and he changed. And when he talked to me about it, I was blown away by how it felt the same as my insight. It had no description that was the same, but it felt the same. And I said, this guy I want to work with, because his insight and my insight feel the same. Does that make sense, Greg?
Yeah, one thing that I'm reminded of while we're talking about this is that, Amy brought up changing our thoughts. And it hit me one time what we're actually trying to point at when we say changing our thoughts. We're not literally, it's like if we have this depressed thought, we're not literally like taking it like Play-Doh and remolding it into a happy thought. What's happening is that every possibility exists in every moment. We can be happy, we could be sad, we could be ecstatic, we could be bored, we could be whatever. And our experience of that moment is entirely dependent on that psychological nature of us, where we are thinking beings with habits and preferences and all of that stuff going on. So we're constantly filtering everything through our previous experiences as if that's somehow going to improve our future experience. So we have all of these different possibilities always available to us. And I think that's more of what the principles are pointing toward, rather than they're pointing toward happiness. They're just pointing toward the fact that we can experience anything in any moment. And it's just our conditioned thinking that creates, what part of that we experience and what we see. What kind of glasses do we have on? That's what we're looking with. We've got a certain prescription glasses, and guess what? That's what we're going to see until we change that prescription on our glasses. You're not changing the thinking. You're not changing thought. Every thought exists at every moment. But we can change which thoughts we see in the moment just based on our preferences, and letting go is a huge thing. And I posted something on my page about, I love it, actually posted it last year for the first time. It's about, the meme says, the leaves are about to show us how beautiful letting go can be. And I think about that every fall time, just that letting go and starting anew. And even the trees go through that period of that gray period where there appears to be no life to it. And that's where a lot of people lose hope and give up, when they're in their own like personal winter, not even realizing that spring's right around the corner. And they're going to have new leaves, and they're going to be brighter and more beautiful than the old leaves. And guess what? Even those need to go away at some point, no matter how bright and beautiful those leaves are. And you see that in the spring. They come out and they're so bright green and just everything's just so alive. And then as we get through the summer, they start to darken a little bit. They get that darker green, and then they brown out, and they get all the colors, and they get all that going on. It's the same thing we do with our beliefs. If we let things flow is the important part of it. Just letting things come and go as they naturally do. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Misty, what do you think?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Greg, you're speaking right to my heart as a former optician. You know, glasses speak right to my heart. And just yesterday, I was going to, Harry saying that you and Greg and how you're able to meet. Just yesterday, I wrote a letter to my grandma back in Oklahoma and thinking, here in Hawaii, the leaves rarely change color. But I was thinking about her, she's a great grandma now, and she's got all these great grandbabies, and her backyard is something that I always remember, and the leaves changing, because she's got this huge backyard full of leaves that change. And there's this oneness that we experience when we're present minded, and we suspend this judgment, this busyness of our mind, that we take all this time that we're I read this thing yesterday, or I heard this thing yesterday that George Pransky said about our innate wisdom is like the soft flute, and our other thinking is the brass band. And that is just what it feels like when we're present-minded. We can just hear that flute, and all the other noise just kind of, now we need the brass band. It's what keeps us alive as a species. Thank goodness for the brass band, Thank goodness that we're aware that the leaves change, and thank goodness we have glasses, because otherwise you don't want to be on the roads with me. That's a fact. But that innateness, that innate wisdom, that's what brings us together. That's what we hear. That's what we feel. That's why I can see those leaves changing when you talk. I had a conversation. That's what I love about the principles, is that I was having a conversation the other day, and in following up, somebody asked me, what was that book we were talking about? And I said, oh gosh, well, it could have been Someone Should Have Told Us, or it could have been The Big Book by Dr. Johnson, which I don't know which one it was. And so I sent the Audible link to Big, and they listened to it. And then I just happened to stumble upon that Dr. Johnson was going to be on today. And that's the principles. That's the way it works, is that you just, when you're listening, when you're present minded, I had no idea that today was the start of the season. I had no idea that, I just happened to download Dr. Johnson's book the other day because, I think Chris got on to me the other day about listening to Sid too much, and I needed to relax because I was a little too intense. And Dr. Johnson just happened to be speaking to my heart that day. And that's what the principles are about. It's about relaxing and not spending so much time in that, mind of, itemizing and thinking, and, that brass band of paying too much attention, and relaxing back into hearing that soft flute, watching those leaves change, and just feeling that oneness. And because we don't have those leaves changing here, I send everybody to the ocean, because there's nothing to do there, but listen to the ocean. You can't stop a wave. And I don't know, I was just really grateful to have all those things come at once. And that's the beauty of the principles for me, is that when I get out of the way and I stop thinking, my wisdom just rises. So that's what comes up for me, Harry. Thanks for
that's exactly how it works. Perfectly said, Misty. Honest, beautiful. It's we're learning to let go of this, because for whatever the reason, this is the past. Yet, without our intellect, we wouldn't even be here. So obviously, I treasure it. I love being in the practical world. I love, I posted. I went boogie boarding with my 5-year-old grandson on the lake, and you could see his mind wrestling with this boogie board that was almost as big as him, but he was enthralled. We need that. We need that enthrallment, that feeling of what our life is. And when we have that feeling, it breaks all the boundaries of the past. And I love that. I love that. I love that I'm a baby, but I love that freedom that it brings. And summer is all about taking time for yourself, so you're just not always full with your own reality. It's hard to quiet. It's hard to live in the silence, and yet it's the only thing that heals. I mean, really heals. And even Sid, they did a test on his mind, and he was only in that space 80% of the time. The other 20%, he was da 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 da. And so we are obviously mixing that beautiful thing together. I honestly, Amy, I don't honestly understand it, to be honest. I mean it. I honestly don't understand it, but I certainly am fast. I'm certainly love what it is.
Yeah, it's really beautiful what you shared, Misty, and I love that example, that metaphor of the band and the flute is to me kind of like a perfect example of that's a psychological concept. It's telling us how our thinking and how our experience works, right? And to me, it's like that perfect marriage of like, this is what the principles are so amazing at, is helping us see, here's what comes of form. And then by understanding our psychology just a tiny bit, we can kind of make some sense of what's going on, so that we can be freed up to see what's beyond it. So that kind of 1-2 punch, I think, is so great. Like, we don't need to analyze things and go in the past and all that, but I have found it so helpful for people to have like just that thing that George shared, little bits of like, here's how human experience works. Because as soon as we just have a glimpse of that, we can let it go. Otherwise, you're like, why do I have a brass band on my head? Do you have a brass band in your head? I have a brass band on my head. Is that normal? Am I sick? What's wrong? But it's like, if we just don't know, that's just what minds do. Then people are like, okay. Then they fall into what's beyond it so much more easily. So that's a really interesting kind of line to toe a little bit, where we don't need to dig so much into the form, but to give enough of the form that helps people relax and see your form's normal. You're just like everybody else for the most part. Now let's see what's beyond it. Yeah, that's really powerful.
And one of the things I've noticed, Amy, is if you don't have that understanding that you're talking about, I hear a lot of people have a beautiful spiritual or psychological insight, and then they get disappointed. Perfect state of mind. If you don't have that understanding you're talking about, you're going to confuse the issue and walk away from the innate health.
Yes, because we all feel our innate health all the time, but without some kind of framework to know what we're feeling, then we just dismiss it, or we just, like you said, we just tell stories about it, or we think that was a fluke or whatever. So I think that's really important too, is to see is like, the feeling is natural. The insights are spiritual. We don't have to do anything to get or earn that stuff. I mean, it's happening all the time, but at the same time, we don't have to do anything. And when we have a sense of how it all works together, hugely helpful, because we'll recognize it. We'll have eyes to see it. When we get peaceful, we'll know, that's me. Because I used to get peaceful all the time and think, oh, that's the ocean or the leaves or a quiet house, or, as we do, right? But now it's like, oh no, that's me. And that's everything. It's huge.
And it is a really simple thing, because it really, if there is any doing at all, it's just in the simple undoing of what you already believe, of just letting go. Like we were talking about earlier, that just that idea of realizing that what's there in front of you right now might not be what you think it is.
Yeah.
It's something that we've created internally and developed our own pair of glasses to see the world with. So if we just learn to maybe just take those glasses off for a while and use our natural vision, it may be a little blurry for a while, but eventually we come into focus and we just see what else is there. All of those opportunities. That's kind of the beauty of it.
It's almost like, Greg, when you take your mind off the problems, the world opens up to unlimited potential, and your dreams start to become what you're living, because you can see thought manifesting. It's amazing you to see that thought manifest. Most of my thought never manifested because I had a thought, but it also came with a lot of fear or doubt or worry. But when it's uncontaminated, you're just really a receiver acknowledging something from within yourself. I don't understand that, but something within myself is being expressed. And that mystical experience is the reality we're living in.
It's so interesting. Someone just reached out, and her son got engaged, and they're young, in their early 20s, got engaged to a woman he was kind of on and off with. And now he's freaking out, and, I don't know, and this is the right thing, and all of this. And she's like, how do I support him through this? And the thing that just seems so clear is it kind of what you said here. You just made me think of it as like, when we're in a place where life's just moving through us and just living through us, we literally can't go wrong. I mean, we probably can't go wrong either way, but thought is like, things are just going to manifest, and like life is just going to live itself through us. Where we suffer and think we're going wrong, which leads to more suffering, is when it looks like, and this is what I told her, like maybe you can just help him see that no matter what happens here, it's going to be okay. Because it just feels like if you take that pressure off and you just open that up, he can have a thought that says yes, he can have a thought that says no, he can have a thought about calling it off and all the problems that's going to cause and all this, but all of that gets to just move through him, like you were saying, without the fear, without the seriousness. And eventually it's like turning on a faucet that you haven't turned on in months. It's kind of spurty and not so good in the beginning, but eventually it starts just flowing more clearly. And I always think of that, it's like, well, just let the crap come up, and it's going to be confusing and you're not going to know what to make of it, but just let it keep coming. And if you're not in the way of it, it has to get clear. Something has to shift. It has to get clear eventually.
And one thing I want everyone to understand, you don't know when eventually is. It just is. It will happen, but
yeah, and you don't know what clear is. So I don't mean he's going to wake up and say, "Oh, I should marry her." Like, no, maybe the date passes and nothing happens, and that's the clarity, right? So exactly, you don't know when, even eventually and clear. Like, those are just concepts too that we can grab onto.
That's so true. I was working with a group, and the last thing that you really want to see happen with a group is for them to, especially a group that has already gone through trauma, for them to have another traumatic experience. And yet that's what happened. And right as it was going on, we were working through, life doesn't happen to us, it happens through us. Mm-hmm. And we got to literally have that experience. We had to shift where we meet. We had to shift how we meet. We had to shift all these things. And so many times, people who've experienced trauma get all these labels thrown on them. And they start to believe those things about them because they're in that place in their mind that they are these things. And it was this wonderful experience where I got to get out of the way as a facilitator and watch these individuals find themselves and experience whatever that clarity was for them of how they were going to become. It was really just how you are not anything but a conduit. You're just there to experience it. And it was just a really beautiful, beautiful energy to experience, watching like, wow, it really does come through us when we get out of the way. Really, the brass band stops playing quite so loudly, and the flute, you can just hear it. It was a moment where I really was able to see somebody else's health. And that was probably, man, that just makes seeing your own health is awesome. And then when you get to see somebody else's, that's just, wow. That makes every moment just worth showing up for.
What you're talking about, that the energy going through us, the best metaphor I've heard of that comes from Fullscrow. And a very wise shaman. And he says, when you're healing, and he was a big healer, and that's what we are, we're healers, is hollow bones. The more hollow the bones going through us, the more powerful the healing. And that metaphor really syncs to me with what you were describing. When we're like that, we're pure. That's the purity of the principles. And what's amazing, that's the reality we are. I mean, we couldn't go there or be in that silence or that purity unless it was inside of us. And it sounds so strange when we hear the world with its loud noises saying the exact opposite. And yet, that's all we have to do to live a good life. Not only a good life, an amazing life. It's truly, Sid said all our dreams would come true. You just have to wait. And, so I've waited.
I was doing a workshop once with another practitioner, and she used the metaphor of like a hoarder. If you have so much stuff in your home, and sometimes you like hoarding to the point where there's just a tiny little narrow path to make your way through your home. I mean, think how boxed in you get by that. There's just so few places you can go. And I just loved that. It's the hollow bones, right? It's like, but when you have just open space around you, so much potential. Anything has room to just flow right through and fit right through. And you're not grabbing and holding on to and keeping and all of that. It's just such openness.
And the answer is in simplicity. Like, the simpler, the better. Anytime we're having a lot of stuff thinking, about a problem. There's nothing wrong with thinking, obviously. I mean, I'm doing it all the time, but we can make things very complicated, and in that complication, there's like the eye of the hurricane, and you go to the eye of the hurricane, and poof. And again, we can't understand it intellectually. We can only understand it with our feelings and intuitive feelings. It's like the ocean. How does the ocean help us? Well, it helps us because it is so powerful, you know. It just is.
I think all of nature, it's why we're so drawn to it. It helps us because we are it. It shows us how we operate by nature. You know, and but we don't, like, that doesn't make sense intellectually. So we'll never really like see that for the most part. Like, we might see it and we can glimpse it and talk about it. But I mean, think about that. There's something just so, it just such, like, puts you in this trance and just feels so fascinating and inviting by so many, like, this whole conversation has been different things about nature, right? And I mean, yeah, nature's amazing as form, but it's got to be more than that. It's not just that the form of nature looks really cool and pretty. Like, that's not why everyone just like yearns for it and is so amazed by it. I think there is, like, just watching an ocean breathe and come in and out. It's like, oh yeah, that speaks to us. It's like, oh yeah, that's what I do. That's how we all are, because we are that. Watching the leaves fall, it, as people say, you know, it speaks to their soul. I mean, I think it does. And I think we're just so blessed that we get to have some, whatever bit of little understanding of that we have, because now we see, you know, we get to kind of, again, not just blow it off and think, oh, I love the ocean, it makes me feel so peaceful, but we can draw those connections and see, oh, because that's how humans work. And that just, I don't know, I think it just enriches it so much.
There's definitely something more to nature than just the visual appeal. Even a sunset, you've seen all of those colors before. You know, obviously not in that exact combination, but you've seen that before visually. But there's something else to it. There's an energy there that you can't see, but you can feel.
Yeah.
And there's something about getting out in the woods where you can't hear any human anything. You're hearing nothing but nature. You just hear birds and, you know, crickets and whatever. And there's just something that you feel in those moments. And I believe it's because at those moments in time, you're not worrying about stuff. You're not thinking about life. You're not looking at how you're going to pay your bills or anything like that. You're just experiencing what's there when you're in those moments. You know, you've dropped away all of your personal beliefs, and you're just experiencing what is, and what you feel is really truly you. You know, like what we've been talking about today, overall, what we keep hearing is it's all one. We divide it up so we could try to make sense of it all, but there is no making sense of it. And the more we divide it up and the more we come up with duality and non-duality, well, you can't have non-duality without duality. It's right there in the name. So it's obviously one. We're all talking about the same thing and just using different verbiage. And if we could just realize that part right there, that would change the world quite a bit. If people would stop fighting about who's right and what wording is the right wording to use to describe something, and just say, hey, if you want to talk about it that way and I talk about it this way, cool. We're all talking about the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's no different than any religious war. That every war's been religious for the most part, right? Like, it's no different than that. It's like all religions share some essence, and then we just argue about the details and create wars about the details, and the whole thing and the principles too, that just, yeah, it's like, it's so ironic. It's the same with religion. It's so ironic because it's like that essence that really connects all of it. Principles, like any other spiritual philosophy or understanding, all religions, that essence is like, it's the best thing ever. It's the root of whatever. I can't even put words to it, but you know what I mean. It's like the best thing in the world, the best thing. And yet we're spending so much time at times looking away from the best thing to argue about the details about the best thing. Like this came up, I was talking to just a friend last week and about this kind of thing and the principles. And I'm like, it's almost like you have the absolute like best cake in the world, the most delicious cake ever known to man. And we're arguing about whether the package should have been blue or green. And it's like, just eat the damn cake. Like, really? Do we really care about the color of the box? And again, it's extra ironic because we're not just arguing about, stuff people argue about, like politics or this or that. We're arguing about, we're missing the best thing available to any of us to argue about details.
I'm in my PsyD right now. And it's funny. I'm so grateful to be in the principles, having this understanding before going into a PsyD program. It does make me a little slower in my program because I'm in the history of psychology right now. And so as I go through my book, because I'm old school and I like actual paper books, I sit there and I read it and I'm like, ooh, that's principle. Ooh, that's principle. Ooh, that's principle. And then I realized like, oh, I've done nothing as far as like getting data for the paper I'm supposed to write. And then I have to go back and I have to read it again because all I've done is go, oh, that feels good. Oh, that feels good. It's cool how you can see like, this is forever. Like this has been forever. This has been this. When you were talking, Greg, about like how this energy is in everything. And then, Amy, when you're talking about how people can argue about anything, it's funny. I was just reading about, the era of skepticism and how they were like, we're just not going to adhere ourselves to anything because people can argue about anything. And that's really what you're saying is that was a time that people were like, no, we're just not going to argue because anytime you say that something can't be found true, well, then of course it can be found untrue. And so that's really, when I send a client who's all up in anxiety and I send them out to the ocean, go try to stop a wave. Go see if you can do that. Go do that. Yeah. You're about as likely to do that as you are to solve whatever problem you're trying to solve in your head. Those are the moments that, that's what it's like to think that you can stop a wave. And that's that energy that I just love. I love to fall back in, get out of my way, and stop trying to eat the box or what color the box should be or, no arguing about it. You just sit back.
Yeah. Well, for what it's worth, even though it's making it harder for you to write your papers, perhaps, I think you having this understanding is only going to help you ultimately in that so much, because you just see the bigger picture. You see the bigger connections. Like when there's a million siloed different theories and approaches and all of that, you are so attuned to what connects all of them. And then anybody can learn the details of those, but you have the important stuff.
While you were talking, I had a thought. When I went into the indigenous world, Sid said, don't use mind, thought, and consciousness. Use spirit, thought, and consciousness. And there you really see the connection between the spiritual and the psychological. Because when the three of you were talking about nature, Greg, Misty, and Amy, that was really indigenous talk. That was spirit. We're, as Greg says, we've seen the colors before. There's the spirit. Mm-hmm. And that is the way they see life. Spirit of the rocks, spirit of the ocean, spirit of whatever it is. And it's all connected by the Great Spirit. That's all Sid's talking about. But the word mind, he started to talk a lot more about that, because the psychologist came and he says it's just a psychological word for God. And so as we've been listening to this connection and how we can sometimes get lost in our words, the beauty is it's inside of us, and it's up to us to express what we see, and in a beautiful, loving, and as wise a way as possible. And the only thing I see is there's a lot of love out there. All we have to do is say yes. A lot of love, a lot of love. Even here, you could feel it in the room. There's a lot of love. You know, Ivan talking, Misty talking, Greg, a lot of love. And that feeling will take us to who we are and our connection to spirit. And if we express it psychologically or spiritually, as Amy was saying, big deal. You know, it's the same thing. And
And I wonder if the only difference between spirituality and psychology is just that spirituality is who we are and psychology is us trying to explain that.
That's actually,
I mean, that's it. There's no real difference. It's just one is the experience and one is the explanation. Yeah.
The explanation that cannot be explained.
Yeah.
That's psychology.
That's good. That makes a lot of sense, because we're living it anyway, right? So psychology is just when we get in and put labels on it and try to talk about it.
And we know people want that. So of course it has a use.
But they want it, but they mostly want it because they think they need it in order to be happy. So we get to show them, no. Well, you know, again, my approach is typically like, let me give you enough to quiet that, and let me show you what it's really about. But either way, they only want it because people just want to be at peace. That's it. So it's great to see that explanation isn't going to bring the peace.
And yet it might.
Like
Yeah. So.
It just came to mind. There's I'll paraphrase it because I don't know exactly what the wording was, but the ancient philosopher Talopa, he talked about, he's attributed for talking about enlightenment being found by having a mind that is open to everything and attached to nothing. And it makes perfect sense here because it's about that flow. That's the reality of life, is that there is a flow and nothing is static. Everything is dynamic, constantly changing. And it's when we try to stop the change, when we try to stop the wave in the ocean, that's when we get frustrated, and that's when we get upset and angry and things don't go our way. Because it's not supposed to go our way. We're just supposed to go with the flow of life, and we can kind of steer a little bit, but if we go with the flow, we have a much better experience.
The truthful flow, not our own, you know. Yeah. There is only one truth. And
that's love.
I don't. Yeah.
It's what it always comes down to. It's what our conversations always end up pointing back to, is love.
Such a beautiful word. I want more of that.
Forget the word. I want the experience. No, this has been awesome. Thanks for joining us, Amy. This has been a really good conversing. Glad you brought up something you know nothing about, like you said. You don't get into. Like, I just don't touch it.
Yeah, no, well, it was good for me. It was helpful for me too. So thank you guys all for sharing, and it was great.
Well, thanks again for joining us.
Amy,
thanks.
Okay. Go ahead, Greg. No, I thought we were already finished. So
Yeah, just wanted to thank everybody for participating and making this a really great discussion today. And look forward to seeing everybody in a couple weeks here. So enjoy the rest of your day and love to everyone.